Erev Tov. My name is Todd Rockoff, and I am the CEO at the Tucson J. I have the distinct honor of being in conversation this evening with Dr. Daniel Gordis. It is a pleasure to welcome you to our post-film discussion about the movie Upheaval, The Journey of Menachem Begin. I would like to start by thanking Jeff Artsy and Uru Motors for their generous support of this evening's event. This program is also supported by the Israel Innovation Fund for Engagement through the JCC Association. Tonight is a part of our community's 2022 celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut through the Weintraub Israel Center. The Weintraub Israel Center is a partnership between the Tucson J and Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona. This program is also a partnership with Z3, a platform for Israel engagement through the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto. We have embraced the founding principles of the Z3 platform in building our own Israel engagement strategy. Those foundational principles are unity, not uniformity, engaging as equal partners, and a diversity of voices. Before I introduce you to our speaker tonight, it is my pleasure to share with all of you for a brief moment our generative mission statement for the Weintraub Israel Center. This statement is meant to provide a framework that will invite each of us to go on our own individual journey with Israel and Israelis as we activate our community's journey. We invite you to look at this, and we will see it again later today as we consider our journey through Israel throughout our program today. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Daniel Gordis. Daniel Gordis is a Senior Vice President and Koret Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College. He is the author of 12 books and the widely read blog and podcast, Israel from the Inside. Gordis' History of Israel, entitled Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, received the 2016 National Book of the Year Award from the National Jewish Books. Ambassador Dennis Ross, reflecting on the book, wrote, "When I am asked, is there one book to read about Israel, I now have that answer." Gordis' writing has appeared in magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine, Azure, Commentary Magazine, and Foreign Affairs. In 2014, the Jerusalem Post listed him as one of the world's 50 most influential Jews. While Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic has written, "If you asked me, of all the people you know, who cares the most about the physical, moral, and spiritual health of Israel? I would say commentator and scholar Daniel Gordis at the top of my list." Gordis' most recent book, entitled We Stand Divided, The Rift Between American Jews and Israel. Gordis and his wife live in Jerusalem. They have 3 married children and several grandchildren. We welcome you and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Todd. Great to be here.
Before I open up the conversation with Daniel, I would like to invite each of you to share your questions in the chat or using the Q&A function throughout our discussion, and we will do our best to respond during the time that we have together. So let me start by asking you, you wrote the book, Menachem Begin, The Battle for Israel's Soul. In researching that book, what surprised you in learning more about Begin, his history, and his practice?
You know, I grew up in a Ben Gurion house, I guess you'd have to say. Ben Gurion, of course, was Begin's nemesis, his primary political rival. There are those who say that Ben Gurion had tried to kill Begin during the Antolena. They were at opposite sides of the political divide. And in my family's house, we had pictures of family members on the wall, but there was only one person who was not a family member whose photograph always appeared in the kitchen in one of those little Dax plastic frames that were from the 1970s. And that was David Ben Gurion. And he would follow us around from house to house, kitchen to kitchen, in his little yellow crew neck sweater that faded over the years. I really grew up in a house in which David Ben Gurion was the guy. And so when I was approached about writing the book about Menachem Begin, I was like, Begin? I mean, Begin, the right-wing maniacal terrorist, are you out of your mind? And the person who proposed the book said, well, you know what, why don't you just go spend a week, read some books, go to the Begin Center, take a look around. And what I was really most moved by was the degree to which, while he was very much on the political right and certainly not in any way unsure of his political views, he was actually a great liberal. And by liberal, I don't mean left wing. I mean liberal in its real sense, liberal in the sense of a person committed to political liberalism, meaning the value of the individual, the autonomy of the individual, civil rights for all, and so on and so forth. Too often these days, the political right in many countries across the world seems not to be deeply committed to that. But Begin, like Jabotinsky, his teacher, was really the ultimate liberal. And for me, that was one of the most surprising things that I had not yet known. And one of the things that I tried to bring to fore in writing the book and telling his story.
Terrific. You know, along the way, I was once taught, I think it was Haviv Gur, that said to me the 1977 election was actually a proof text that Israel was a democracy. Can you comment on why the Labor Party then stayed in power for so long before there was a movement to, in this case, to the Likud?
Yeah, so why? That's a great question. So first of all, I think that Gur is right. I mean that the notion that you could have labor in power for 29 years and you could have Menachem Begin, who was the ultimate outsider. He'd lost 7 elections in a row, have him win, take power, have the Labor Party cede power without any question whatsoever. I mean, that really was, I think he's quite right, that was really a proof that Israel's democracy functioned. By the way, just in the same way that Netanyahu's losing the election in this particular instance last year, or a little bit more than a year ago, and having this particular coalition take office is, again, an example of that. Whatever one thinks, and Netanyahu was not happy about losing, to put it very mildly, but we did not have claims that the election was stolen. We didn't have claims that there was something, broken about the system. Just he was unhappy that he lost. So I think that there have been several elections in Israel's history that have proven, despite everybody's predictions to the contrary, that it is really very much a functioning democracy. Now, if it's a functioning democracy, your question, Todd, is great. So then how did labor stay in power for 29 years? I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. We could just we can thumbnail them really quickly. I mean, one of them, of course, is that it was David Ben-Gurion, right? I mean, at the beginning, at least, not all 29 years were him, of course, but it was his party. It was the party that had founded the country. And therefore, I think there was a tremendous amount of loyalty to the founders of the country. And people really felt when they were voted out in 77, people said, they wrote in their diaries, you could hear it in the news, how could we have done that to the founders of this country? I mean, what did they do to deserve this? So that was one piece. It was the founders. It was David Ben-Gurion, who was the George Washington, so to speak, larger than life figure. Another issue, of course, is that Israel was a deeply socialist country, and the right was running on a non-socialist program. So to the degree that you were a committed socialist, and most Israelis were back then, the right was not only the wrong position about foreign policy or whatever else, the right was it was anti-socialist. And therefore, you could agree or disagree about a lot of things. But even if you disagreed with the left about many of its issues, you were not going to abandon socialism. I mean, so that's yet another reason. A third reason, of course, is that it was Begin. It's the factor that it was Ben-Gurion on the left. It was also the fact that it was Begin on the right. And Begin was detested by the left. I mean, he had accrued for himself, or he'd been saddled with this image of the terrorist and the crowd haranguer and all of that sort of thing. So there are many factors, but I think the fact that it was the party of the founders on one hand, the party of the military underground, so to speak, that was the opposition and therefore disparaged, and finally the socialist, non-socialist issue that worked for a very long time, until it became clear, by the way, as has happened in American politics often also, that the party that was supposedly the party of the working man, I use that term, in quotes because we don't say that anymore, but the party that had been the party of the working person was now the party of the elites. I mean, we can all remember a day in American politics, for example, when rank and file blue-collar workers all voted Democratic. But over the course of time, of course, the Democratic Party became perceived by some as the party of the intellectual elites, the blue coasts, and so on and so forth. And the same thing happened in Israel. I mean, the Labor Party became associated with entitlement and privilege and so on and so forth. And who voted Begin in? The poor, dark-skinned Mizrahi Jews, who were the ones who felt cast to the side by the Labor Party. So they were the victims of their own success and elitism to a certain extent.
Right. Well, I want to kind of follow up on that. In your book, You mentioned that Begin's speeches were devoid of mentioning Israelis. Rather, he would talk of Jews, brothers, brethren. Do you think that this tactic that he took was really at the forefront of the concept of peoplehood?
Yeah, he was the ultimate peoplehood person. I mean, I'll give you several examples. I mean, Begin, obviously he cared deeply about Israel, and he was not embarrassed about saying Israel or Israelis. He was not conflicted about Israel. This was not a guy who was, in any way unsure about Israel's right to exist. But he was the ultimate peoplehood person. So, for example, when he was prime minister and he was working to get Soviet Jews, I mean, that's actually an issue that's come back into the news, new Jews from that part of the world. And are they going to get out? And are they going to be able to get out? And if they get out, where are they going to go? And all of that. But Begin was one of the ones who was responsible for Russian Jews getting out. And they would go to Vienna. And in Vienna, they could make a choice. They could either go to Tel Aviv, fly to Tel Aviv and become Israelis, or they could fly to America. And a lot of them were choosing to fly to America. And there's a lot of Israelis who would have worked very hard for their right to get out of the Soviet Union, were infuriated. And they would go to Begin and they would say to him, you got to put a stop to this. This is ridiculous. We're working to get them out of the Soviet Union. And then they're choosing to go to America. And Begin would always say, that's the whole point of freedom. We're working for them, not because we want them to become Israelis. We're working on their behalf because they're Jews. We're committed to Jews wherever they are. And if they choose to live their Jewish lives in America, or they choose to live not terribly Jewish lives in America, whoever they might be, that's their right. I mean, so he was unwilling to try to pressure Soviet Jews to come to Israel. He was completely race blind. I mean, when he said that he was race blind, he really was race blind. He just couldn't have cared less what color your skin was. And whereas in the Haganah, which was the underground military operation of Ben-Gurion's party, if you weren't white, European, Ashkenazi, you weren't really going very far. In Begin's Irgun, it didn't matter what color your skin was, and it didn't matter if you were from Syria or Iraq or Iran or Poland. It made no difference. He couldn't have cared less. So he was a peoplehood person in terms of Soviet Jews. He was a peoplehood person in terms of skin color. And by the way, I mean, American Jews were appalled when he was elected in 1977. Appalled. They were like, oh my God, Israelis just elected this terrorist. Of course, they didn't know that the terrorist would 2 years later bring peace with Egypt. They didn't know that he would get the Nobel Peace Prize. They didn't know a lot of things about that. But what they very quickly discovered was that he was actually much more Jewish also than many of the prime ministers who would come before him, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, and so on and so forth. And so because he was so deeply Jewish, he actually had a lot in common with American Jews that those more left-wing prime ministers who were only Israeli and much less Jewish on the surface really did. So he was peoplehood through and through. And I think today, his model of peoplehood is something that we could really look back on and try to see if we could recreate to a certain extent, because it's definitely eroded since then.
I think so. I guess that, as Israel is now 74 years young, can you talk from your perspective why the country was created in the first place, and what was it created to do? What is it in business to do from its creation?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I think we always say that's wrong, right? I'll give you two answers that are wrong. One of them is that it's a refuge, and that idea has come up a lot, again, with Ukraine. And obviously, it's very important that Ukrainian Jews or Russian Jews or whoever they are have a place to go. That's critically important. And many of us Israelis are very proud that Israel's doors are open to Jews no matter where they come from, and a lot of non-Jews as well. But Israel was not created as a refuge. It was not created to be a place where if every 10, 15, 20 years there's a blow up somewhere in the world, whatever number of Jews need to run away will have a place to go. It's great that they do have that refuge, but we don't live 10 million of us in Israel day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out, so that there'll be a refuge one day. And the other thing that we, of course, cite all the time is high tech. And, Israel is the startup nation, and everybody's cell phone has a little Israeli something or other in it. That's also very exciting, and we're proud of that. But Israel was not created in order to be a tech source. Israel was created for a very simple reason, and it's been so successful that we commonly forget what that reason is. But Israel was created to change the existential condition of the Jewish people. Israel was created to change the fact that Jews both in Europe and in North Africa, which is where the plurality of the Jews of the world lived at that time, Israel was created to change the fact that they were victims on call. You could kill Jews at will and get away with it. If you were Jewish, you were going to not rise above a certain glass ceiling anywhere in Europe, Western Europe or Eastern Europe. If you were a Jew in North Africa, there was a limit to how far you were going to rise. You would have to comport yourself in a certain way so as to not attract attention to yourself. Your language was the language that you spoke was not the language of your people. The calendar that you lived by was not the calendar of your people. You were constantly looking over your shoulder, trying not to make waves. We know that the Jew, the shopkeeper Jew, the Jew of the victim of the pogroms, I mean, all of those things, it's so hard for young Americans to remember that kind of Jewish life, precisely because Israel's been so successful. Israel has been so successful at eradicating that previous existential condition that we now forget that it existed. So we have a conversation, do we really need Israel after all? But we are only as confident as we are as Jews, even in America, by the way, because Israel exists. It was created to change the existential condition of the Jewish people.
I love that, and thank you. We may come back to it, but I want to share a question from Diane, who's with us this evening. Why is there a center for Begin and not for the other prime ministers in Israel?
Oh, well, I mean, it's a private enterprise. In other words, it wasn't created by the state. It was created by people who were loyal to Begin. There is a Rabin museum. You could argue that there's a center for, and there is, by the way, a Ben Gurion Center. There's the Ben Gurion House in Sde Boker. There's the Ben Gurion House in Tel Aviv. So there are a lot of places actually devoted to Ben Gurion. There is the Rabin Library, museum, and so forth. But the reason there's a Begin Center is because Begin's supporters and loyalists went ahead and raised the money and built the center. I mean, anybody could do that. People could build a center in honor of Todd or in honor of me. I don't know that either Todd or I have enough people who really care about us that much, but it's not a reflection of anything about the state. Begin evoked a kind of a loyalty that is really very hard to describe. And to this very day, I mean, Begin's been gone a very, very long time. He's been dead 30 years. But if you get in a taxi cab and you ask your driver, if you could bring back any prime minister that you could from the past, who would it be? Doesn't matter the color of that taxi driver's skin, and it doesn't matter their gender, and it doesn't matter where they come from. You're likely to hear Menachem Begin. I mean, he evoked a tremendous amount of loyalty for a whole array of reasons. And if you watch the movie, you saw that loyalty among darker skinned Israelis and lighter skinned Israelis and right wing, and then among the left for peace and so on and so forth. And so when he died, there were people who simply felt that his legacy was so critically important that it needed to be preserved, and they raised the money and built the center.
So with that, leaders leave a legacy. What would you say is the relevant legacy of Menachem Begin today?
It's very complex. It's very, very complex. But look, I think one of the things that Begin really was a reminder of that, he was, I mean, anybody who saw the movie knows this, he was unbelievably ideologically driven. I mean, Israel desperately needed those reparation funds from Germany, desperately needed them. But he was so appalled by the idea that Germany could buy its innocence back that he opposed the taking of the money, even though he knew that Israel needed it. He was deeply ideologically driven. And yet, he was a pragmatist. And I think this idea of pragmatism coupled with profound ideology, it's very easy to be a pragmatist if you don't believe in very much. Or if you believe in a lot, it's very easy to sort of let reality be pushed off to the side. But he was by no means a person who wanted to give up territory, but he did because he thought he had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make peace with Egypt. He lost tremendous amount of support in his own party. He lost lifetime friends who never spoke to him again after he gave back the Sinai. So I think, number one, it's a kind of a passionate devotion to Israel and the Jews, and a passionate devotion to his own personal, convictions and ideology, coupled at the same time with a real openness to grabbing opportunity when it came. At the same time, I would say, I think that one of the legacies of Begin, which is still very much alive today, is an unwillingness to delude himself. In other words, when Sadat said to Begin, we're not making a deal without something for the Palestinians, then Begin basically said, not in so many words, okay, then we're not going to make a deal. Because he said, I am not about to make peace with one Arab country and create another Arab country that's going to be at war with Israel. He was one of those people who said, let's not pretend that the world is what we wish the world is. You may wish that there's a deal to be made with the Palestinians, he would say, but that doesn't mean that there is a deal to be made with the Palestinians. And I think, by the way, ironically and sadly at the same time, most Israelis agree with him now, even the left. The Israeli left does not believe that there's a deal to be made with the Palestinians. I mean, hardly anybody thinks that. The Israeli left wants to make sure that we don't do anything now that would eventually preclude the possibility of a deal with the Palestinians. But I think taking off those rose-colored lenses and looking reality, directly in the eye, that's also a Begin legacy. And then finally, I think, there's many, but if I could say that, something about making space for the minorities, the Jewish minorities in Israel, the Mizrahim, the Sephardim, the Iraqis, and so on and so forth. There is work still to be done, but they have moved so far ahead in Israeli society that it's really extraordinary. And I think his legacy of a color-blind, ethnicity-blind, Jewish Israeli attitude is also one of his great legacies.
So if we take that legacy of being colorblind, and you refer to the fact that there's still work to be done, how is Israel approaching that work that needs to be done to be maybe a little bit more inclusive for Jews of color that are living in Israel?
It is so much less an issue in Israel than it is in America, for example. I mean, in Israel, there's no debate. First of all, they're not a minority. They're the majority. And that's another, we have to remember that most Israeli Jews are Mizrahim. People that look like you and me are the minority of Israeli Jews these days. So partly, you don't have to worry about minority rights because we're the minority. So I mean that really very seriously. I mean, the numbers are just doing what the numbers do. So that's number one. Number two, if you look at the headway, I mean, Israeli culture, Israeli music, Israeli religiosity, those are all now, I think, probably more defined, or at least as defined by the Mizrahi world as by the Ashkenazi world. Are there still probably, areas of Israeli society where it's harder to get ahead because you're not of an Ashkenazi background? Maybe. I would say very few, though. And if there is any residual racism in Israel, of course there's residual racism in Israel. I mean, show me the society that doesn't have racism. And I'll show you a society that only has one race. But there was some racism, to be sure, far too much with the Ethiopians when they first came in. But I mean, the most recent wedding that my wife and I got invited to the other day is an Ashkenazi woman and an Ethiopian man getting married in October. And it's not even that unusual anymore. You say, oh, that's kind of cool. Yeah, for sure, we're going to go to her wedding. But we happen to know her, not him. But so even there, even in the Ethiopian score, race is nothing in Israel like it is in America. Nothing. It is just not nearly the explosive issue, because there's never been anybody who, as a matter of principle in Israel, said white Jews should have rights that darker skinned Jews do not, or this was a country built for white skinned Jews. Nobody ever said that. I mean, Ben Gurion said some pretty nasty things about darker skinned Jews, but it was about their culture when he was swept out of office because he said that. So there's really not a race debate in Israel in the way that there is a huge race debate in America. There obviously is a huge issue in Israel about both Israeli Arabs and Palestinians and Arabs outside. That, to be sure, we have a huge issue with. But in terms of race as such, it's much less of an electric issue in Israel than it is in America, because there's no real debate about whether or not darker skinned Jews should be in part of the mainstream. They are the mainstream.
Thank you. So Lisa in the chat wanted to know, what would Begin think today about the war in Ukraine?
Wow. Well, first of all, whenever you ask what would Begin think about, part of the greatness of Begin was that he was a little bit unpredictable. So I remember when I was writing the book, it was during the time that Obama was pressing Bibi into a building freeze on the West Bank. It was very contentious. Israelis were very opposed to it. Obama was pretty dead set on it. And it was getting to be rather, this was in the early days, but now it doesn't sound so surprising. But back in the day, things were heating up between Obama and Bibi. And it happened to be one day that I was going to Tel Aviv to interview Yechiel Kadishai, who was Begin's right-hand man all throughout his political life. And Kadishai was then still alive, and I met him in his home in Tel Aviv. And at the end of our long conversation, I asked him, what do you think? I mean, if Begin was alive today and he was the prime minister and Obama was pressuring him to do a building freeze in the West Bank, what would he do? And I was expecting Kadishai to say to me, oh, he would, tell Obama, blah, blah, blah. And he said to me, to tell you the truth, I have absolutely no idea. And I think that was actually part of Begin's greatness, meaning what Kadishai was saying is it's really complicated. Now, certain things are not complicated about the war in Ukraine. I mean, there's clearly an aggressor and there's clearly a country being attacked. What I think Begin would say about the war is not really about Israel issues in any way, and it's only minimally about Jewish issues, which are only derivative of other kinds of things. But I think Begin would say, first of all, Ukraine is an example of what Israel cannot allow to happen to itself. In other words, if you're a smaller country, you are always in danger of being eaten alive by a larger country. And if you are stupid enough to delude yourself to think that the West is going to come to your defense, just look at the Ukraine. That's what Begin would say. And if you are stupid enough to think that if Iran ever attacks Israel, the United States is going to come to Israel's defense, Israel's not a member of NATO either. Just go look and see what's happening to the Ukraine. So I think Begin's first takeaway would be to say, you can never be in a position of not being able to defend yourself, number one. Number two, he'd say that part of the reason the West is not taking on Russia is because Russia has a nuclear weapon. If Russia had no nuclear weapons, you might be hearing a very, very different kind of language from the West, or you might be seeing very different kind of actions from those. But Russia is a nuclear power. And God only knows if their nukes work, but we don't want to try to find out. And I think Begin would say, therefore, that's why I blew up the reactor in Iraq in June of 1981, because no standing enemy of the Jewish state, this is what's called the Begin Doctrine, no standing enemy of the Jewish state can ever be allowed to get a nuclear or a weapon of mass destruction, because if they have it, the West will respond the way the West is responding to Russia right now as well. So if anything, I think the war in Ukraine actually gives strength to Israelis' conviction Iran is not getting a bomb. Period. It may make a deal with America and the West. It may not make a deal. It may not make a deal. Israel may have to do it on its own. It may have cooperation from other parties, but Iran is not going to get a bomb if there's anything that Israel can do to stop it. And whether or not Israel can do anything to stop it, of course, I don't know. You don't know. Neither of us know that. So I think those are the two takeaways. And the last thing that I would say that Begin would think is, we saw what Lavrov said in the last couple of days about Hitler having Jewish roots. And Begin would say, anti-Semitism is a virus. It morphs and there are variants, but it never really goes away. And just when you think it's safe to go back in the water, poof, the virus comes up again. And, everybody said, look how great Putin is to the Jews. But all you need is a good reason to start targeting Jews again. And the option is there. So Begin would say there's nothing surprising about that. I mean, the Russians were always horrible to the Jews. Putin looked to be a little bit different because he wanted to give a different, but that he can end that the minute that he wants to. So anti-Semitism wouldn't surprise him. The West's fecklessness and its unwillingness to defend Ukraine wouldn't surprise him. And the warning about your enemy having a nuclear weapon would just reinforce his sense that what he did in Iraq in '81 was so critically important.
So, Rabbi Avi would like to know, what do you believe the future holds for Israeli Arabs and the Haredim?
Well, my little crystal ball, I have no idea. But look, I think there are signs for the reasons, there's causes for optimism on both sides. I mean, look, first of all, you can see in this current coalition may or may not last very long. I mean, people said it wouldn't last for 5 minutes a year ago, and it's still here. People are saying now that it's in its last days. It is, or it's not. I mean, I don't think there's any way for any of us to know. Naftali Bennett's a pretty smart guy. He didn't put this coalition together with Yair Lapid or keep it going as long as he has by being an idiot. It may fall apart. It may not fall apart. I don't know. The coalition, as far as I'm concerned, did its job already by showing that Israeli democracy could get rid of anyone, whether it's Bibi Netanyahu or anybody else who've been prime minister for a very long time, and of making Israel non-toxic once again in European capitals. I mean, I think those are two major accomplishments. And if the coalition folds tomorrow, then the coalition folds tomorrow. We'll go back to elections and we'll see what happens. I don't think it's happening so fast, but I could be totally wrong. But one of the things that this coalition also did, of course, is that it's the first coalition in Israel's history to include an Arab party. And I think it's obviously not an uncontroversial issue either among Jews or among Israeli Arabs. But it is an indication, nonetheless, that Israeli Arabs are beginning to play a different game. Instead of being the opposition to Israel being a Jewish state, which is a losing proposition, which is where they've been for 73 years, they're now saying under Abbas, not Mahmoud Abbas, right, but under Mansour Abbas, what they're saying is, no, Israel's a Jewish state. And what we want as Israeli Arabs is the best deal we can get for ourselves in a Jewish state. And that's a totally different game plan. Is every single Israeli Arab there? Definitely not. Are many more Israeli Arabs there than people might think? Absolutely. The riots of May last year, of May 2021, were so tragic because they really did set us back. And I think there's been a lot of attention given in the last year to the need to mend those fences and to move even further forward the status of Israeli Arabs. But first of all, that Mansour Abbas is a member of the coalition, that he's alive, that he hasn't been deposed by his own party or anything of the sort. I mean, that's actually really important. And my hope is that that will continue, that more and more Israeli Arabs will understand that they are part of a great democracy. Yes, it's not a liberal democracy like America. America is about anybody who wants to be American. It's totally race blind, ethnicity blind, religion blind in theory, and so forth. Israel's not. Israel is the national home of the Jewish people, but it has non-Jewish citizens, and therefore non-Jewish citizens have rights that have to be respected. And I think Israeli Arabs are now saying, yeah, let us be part of that conversation. So I'm optimistic about Israeli Arabs. The Haredi issue is a very serious one. If for no other reason than their numbers are growing very fast. And, I think some 20, 30, 40% in Jerusalem, I think it's close to 40% of first graders are Haredi kids. I mean, so you're talking about an enormous growth. On the other hand, by the way, the more Haredi women become educated, the lower the birth rate goes. We're seeing that all across Israel. So I think it's really very hard to know. My hope would be that the Haredim will become a little bit modernized. I have no vested interest in Haredim not being Haredim. I mean, why would I want that? I mean, the whole point of Israel was that Jews should be able to live however Jews want. I should be able to live how I want Jewishly. A totally secular Israeli should be able to live how they want Jewishly, and a Haredi person should be able to live how they want Jewishly. But we got to get more Haredim into the workforce. The army is much less important. We got to get them more and more of them into the workforce. We got to get more and more Haredi women and men into academic life, into the university system, and so on and so forth. If we don't, we could have a very serious problem. But I'm optimistic that we will. And I'll just say something very quickly about people say, well, how's that ever going to happen? Look at the numbers. Israel, if you remember high school algebra, when we used to solve for X, there's too many variables in Israel ever to solve for X. And if you think of all of the things that Israel people had said, we're going to do Israel in, it could never survive this, it could never survive that, it could never survive the other thing. And it survived all those things. Israel is much more resilient than people tend to give it credit for. I don't know exactly how the Haredi issue is going to get resolved, but I worry about it less than some of my colleagues do, though it is obviously a source of serious concern, and Israelis need to be smart about it.
So with that, what is the deeper idea of Israel living up to its best self? How would you answer the best self for the state of Israel?
Wow. I mean, there's so many different ways, right? I mean, first of all, you could look internally or externally. You could look Jewishly or not Jewishly. The word democracy doesn't appear in Israel's Declaration of Independence. It was in some of the early drafts, and Ben-Gurion wanted it out for complicated reasons that we won't go into right now. But what he wrote in his diary several years later was, I'm not interested in democracy. I'm interested in a state, and this is what the declaration says, in the spirit of the prophets of the Bible, meaning about justice, the widow, the orphan, and so on and so forth. Look, Israel, I think at its very, very best, obviously has to be a fair country, has to be fair to women. It has to be fair to the LGBTQ community, which is, by the way, it's way ahead of where most of the West is. Israel never had a don't ask, don't tell policy, ever, ever, ever. I'll just give you one little example of this, by the way. When our kids were young, our middle son, there's back in the days when, getting a computer in your own room was a very big deal. And so he got a computer in his room. And one day I walked into his room and I just see what the default page on his browser back then, we had those things, was, and I was some stupid website. And I said to him, okay, listen, buddy, you can go wherever you want on the internet. We're not the kind of parents who track, where you are. I just trust you. You can do whatever you want on the internet. But your default browser page has to be the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or back then it was the only option in English, the Jerusalem Post. One of those three. Then you can go wherever you want. Okay, fine. So the next morning he comes down to breakfast and he says to us, what's don't ask, don't tell? So I knew immediately that he'd made the New York Times his default browser page. And I told him what don't ask, don't tell was. And he says to my wife, Ima, tell him to tell me the truth. He's obviously making that up. And she said, no, he's not. He's not making that up. He goes, no, now you're both lying to me. And we said, no, sweetie, that's what don't ask, don't tell. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea that the army would care about your sexuality. I mean, what does the army care who your partner is? And there's been all sorts of ways in which Israel's far ahead. But an Israel that lives up to its better self is got zero gender discrimination, zero discrimination based on sexual orientation or any of those issues. And I think it's done fairly well, but certainly far from perfect. I think it's a country that has a very serious social agenda. In other words, it cares about the poor. It cares about what the prophets would call the widow, the orphan, and so on and so forth. Has a social agenda the way the old socialist parties did and the way that most parties today don't. Has to recoup that. I think an Israel that lives up to its very best self is also an Israel that keeps very much in mind the story of the Jewish people, the story of what it was to be a people that had nowhere to go. I was one of those people who felt very strongly that Israel should open its doors to Ukrainians. Ukrainians were not going to come to Israel by the millions. And they were not, I'm talking about non-Jewish Ukrainians, and they were not going to come to Israel by the hundreds of thousands. Germany's open, France is open, England is open, all those countries you can get on a bus or a train and go to those countries are all open. How are you going to get on an airplane? You have no cash, you have no, they weren't going to come to Israel en masse. I felt though, and I still feel, that Israel should have said, anybody that wants to come can come. At least now you can have temporary residency here. You may not be able to get citizenship for the long run. We'll figure that out down the road, but we're not going to leave a human being without a place to go. I think that very few would have come, very few more than actually did come would have come. But I think it would have been a very important statement about the Jews having memory of what it was like to be a people that had nowhere to go. And so I think, that example, it's got to be a country that's always pursuing peace. Those things sound bumper sticker like, but I think that is Israel's best self. And that's what I hope it'll become more of.
It reminds me of both the story in your book as well as in the movie, when they talked about Begin opening the doors of Israel to the boat people. And for me personally, I found that I had no idea. I remember as a young person hearing about the boat people, and then to read that not only did Begin say, yes, you should come, because he remembered, and I think he told President Carter, right, it's because the St. Louis was turned away from Canada, so on and so forth, and all those people were sent back, that he welcomed them in, and the people of Vietnam who were on that boat are now Israeli citizens and have learned Hebrew.
Right. Right. I mean, he not only welcomed them, as you point out correctly, he made them citizens. He gave them some money. They got taught Hebrew. One of those Vietnamese boat people has become a leading Israeli poet, a very interesting woman. So yeah, and people now, by the way, when people disagree with me about the Ukrainian issue, and then somebody even says, "But look at Begin and the boat people," they're quite right. That was a few dozen people. They weren't going to grow more. It was a boat floating in the middle of the China Sea, and they were out of food, out of water. They were giving children 1 teaspoon of water a day, and adults were getting nothing. And this Israeli ship, the Uvali, happened to be sailing by them and found it. So it's not exactly an analogous situation. There was not going to turn into hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese boat people. It wasn't. But Begin did the right thing. Begin did an extraordinary thing. And I think that that was Israel living up to its best self. And we can and should do more of that.
That's great. So Jeff has asked, how do you think, and again, it's a question of what do you think Begin would think, but how do you think Begin would have felt about the removal of the parliamentarian?
Oh, Amichai Chikli.
Yeah.
That's a hard one. I mean, look, Amichai Chikli was removed by, according to the parliamentary, who happens to be a friend of mine. So, I'm not taking sides here. And I didn't vote for Bennett, by the way. I've never voted for anybody who's been prime minister. So ever. But look, I think Amichai Chikli, he was a bit of a rebel. And I think the coalition was willing to look the other way until more people started to bolt the coalition. And then they felt we better put a stop to this. But that's just playing by the rules. I mean, that is the rules of the Israeli parliament. There's nothing immoral about it. That's the rules. It's like a filibuster. Is a filibuster immoral? Well, I mean, isn't it immoral to stop other people from getting their argument made? Yeah, sort of, I guess. But that's the rules of the Senate. It's a similar kind of a thing to that. I don't think Begin would have had anything particularly Begin-esque to say about it. He knew very well how to play the games in the Knesset. And he might go tisk, tisk, tisk because he either agreed with Chikli or didn't agree with Chikli. But I don't think he would think this was a major issue. It was an issue of just like Congress, has people can get bumped off of committees for this or that. There's internal politics to any parliament. And this is just that. I don't think Begin would feel very strongly about Chikli, who I happen to like a lot personally, by the way, in any way particularly.
So if Begin or Begin's persona were here today, where would he fall on the political landscape? Because when he was elected, he was seen as so far to the right, especially by labor. Where would he be today?
That's a really interesting question. He would not be in the Likud. I mean, he would be disgusted with the Likud. He was, when he left office in 82, he moved in with his daughter because he had nowhere to go. They had rented an apartment when he was the head of the opposition on Rosenbaum 1 in Tel Aviv. Then he won the Nobel Prize. He got $1 million for the Nobel Prize. He gave it all away. To this day, it still generates prize money. And then after he left Rosenbaum 1, he moved into the prime minister's house and wasn't going to make any money as prime minister. And so when he left the prime ministership, he literally had nowhere to go. He didn't have any money to rent a house or rent or buy a place. Eventually, those same kinds of friends, by the way, who built the Begin Center also, pooled some money together and bought him an apartment. But the corruption that is associated with Bibi, and there are very, very few Israelis who say he didn't do anything wrong at all. There's a lot of Israelis who say he probably crossed the line, but you shouldn't be prosecuting him. But that he's, squeaky clean. I don't know anybody that actually thinks that. I think Begin would be disgusted by the corruption in Israel. So, by the way, on the left also, on the left and in the rabbinate and in the police. I mean, he would be disgusted by corruption in general. Israel has an enormous corruption problem. And if you look at all kinds of international studies of Israel, where it ranks in the OECD countries in terms of corruption, it's bad. So Begin would be very, very unhappy in general about that, and he would be very unhappy with the Likud. On the other hand, though, he wouldn't be on the far right because he gave up territory to make peace. I mean, the far right today is annexationist. Now, Begin's supporters who are on the right today would say, yeah, but the Sinai was not biblically the land of Israel, which is why he could give up the Sinai. He would never give up any part of the West Bank because that is biblically the land of Israel. Maybe. I mean, that is a fair argument to a certain extent. But, he's not here. So we don't know exactly what he would say. He would be somewhere, ironically, I think he would be somewhere in the center right, but not the right. He would not be on the far left. And there's really no far left in Israel. There's no real even center left in Israel. The left in Israel died during the Second Intifada because the left had always been predicated on land for peace. But the minute that Arafat was offered land in 2000 and chose Intifada, most Israelis recognized, oops, the left was actually predicated on a pipe dream that was never realistic, which was exactly what Begin had said all those years. So he wouldn't be on the left, but he wouldn't be on the far right. he'd be somewhere in the middle, ironically. And Israel, by the way, is still one of those countries that has a political middle. If you look at a lot of European countries, maybe even the United States, depending on how you skin the cat, the political middle is either evaporating or slowly getting smaller, or whatever the case may be. Israel has a very substantial political middle, and I think Begin would probably be some part of it.
Terrific. So I'm going to just take a moment. Our friend Zach Bodner has a question, and I just want to both thank Zach for being here with us tonight, but also for being the visionary to have created the Z3 platform at the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto. So Zach would like to know if we think that Israeli leaders have a different view of diaspora Jews than Begin did, meaning do they embrace us or do they still think we ought to make Aliyah?
First of all, I want to say hi to Zach, because Zach is really, has done really extraordinary work with Z3, and I've had the privilege of speaking at Z3 a couple of times, and I think it's fabulous that the Oshman Family's JCC has done that, and that you, Todd, and your JCC have partnered with them. Zach has done really great work there, along with his colleagues. I would say that it's neither. The idea that all American Jews should make Aliyah, I think Israelis have stopped talking that way a long time ago. The last person that really spoke that way was Ariel Sharon, and even he, at the end of the day, kind of gave that up. But I think most Israelis would say, and I'm not saying this to necessarily make people happy, but I think what most Israelis really would say is, you don't really matter that much. And how do we know that? Because at the end of the day, this is not Daniel Gordis speaking, don't get me wrong here. This is what I think most Israelis would say is, we're totally independent here. It's great to have America's support. And again, I think Bibi was wrong to say this, and I think Ron Dermer was wrong to say this, but it doesn't make it incorrect. And that is that statistically, the American Jewish community relative to the evangelical community is tiny. So far, it's shifting, but so far the evangelicals are pretty wholeheartedly with Israel. And that's what people like Bibi and Dermer used to say amongst themselves. American Jews, they're so critical all the time, we don't have to worry about them. I think it's the wrong thing to say. I think it's the wrong thing to think, but it doesn't make it necessarily factually wrong. When exactly a year ago, in May 2021, when those 90 rabbinical students put out a letter accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing and genocide while Israel was at war with Hamas, and did not mention Hamas one single time. The word Hamas didn't appear in the letter, and the word terrorism didn't appear in the letter. And the fact that Israelis were all running to bomb shelters, secular Israelis in Tel Aviv, and more right-wing Israelis in wherever they are. A lot of Israelis, you could see this in the Israeli press, that rabbinical school letter made the front page of Israeli newspapers. Much more than the GA would, much more than any other conference. That little letter signed by 90 rabbinical students was on the front page of Israeli newspapers. And Israelis said, okay, if we're at war with Hamas and the younger generation of American rabbinical students actually wants to accuse us of what they call ethnic cleansing, literally ethnic cleansing and genocide, are not going to even mention Hamas, just who cares? And I think that's really where the vast majority of Israelis are. I think it's terrible. I think it's wrong. I think it's short-sighted. I think it's terrible for the Jewish people. But if the question is, where are Israelis? That's my view of where Israelis are. And I think that both sides have a tremendous amount of work to try to make things better. American Jews need to, and I tried to write about this a little bit in my most recent book that came out a couple of years ago called We Stand Divided, which is about that relationship between American Jews and Israel. And Todd, I want to thank you for having it right behind your left ear, that yellow book right there. But I point out in the book, American Jews need to understand that Israel has one overwhelming responsibility, and that is to exist. It's got to survive. It doesn't have to always make us proud. It doesn't have to always inspire us, even though it's great when it does, and even though it's great when it can. But Israel has to first and foremost survive. And I think that American Jews need to, and I know we can't go into it at great length now, but really you need to rethink some of the ways in which they think of their expectations of Israel. But Israel, by the same token, has to get off this high horse and say, we don't need them because we have the evangelicals. It's not about the evangelicals. The evangelicals are not part of the Jewish people. If Israel is going to be the state of the Jewish people, then the community in the world that comprises 40-something% of the world's Jews, which is American Jews, is not irrelevant to you. American Jews are not relevant because they give you support in Congress. That's not what the Jewish people's about. American Jews matter because they're almost half of the Jewish people. And if we don't create meaningful dialogue with them, then we're not the state of the Jewish people. We're the state of the Jews who happen to live in Israel. That's a very different kind of Jewish state. And I think it's a much less compelling and much less inspiring kind of Jewish state. So I think that both sides have been very narrow. I think both sides have been very short-sighted. Both sides have been very judgmental. And everybody has to kind of reboot that conversation. But how to do that, of course, is a conversation not about Menachem Begin, but that's a conversation, all unto itself for a different day.
Well, and I think, as we close, and I'd love for you to comment on this, as we advance the idea of Z3 and talk about the idea of being unified without uniform, it opens the door for us to have respectful dialogue with people who disagree with each other. And the idea that if somebody is annoyed at something that Israel is doing, the answer cannot be that the enterprise shouldn't exist. The door should be open to have respectful conversation with people who disagree. And that idea of engaging as equal partners then is very, very important. What are the obstacles to those ideals? And I guess I'm speaking a little bit about your most recent book, which is Above My Left Ear.
What are the obstacles to having that kind of conversation?
Yeah.
Look, I mean, well, first of all, you're pointing out, this whole notion that the enterprise shouldn't exist. The United States is not a perfect country. And the United States has some pretty serious social and moral issues to face. But my friends who are despondent about America, the ones who live in America, my American friends who live in Israel, who are despondent about where America goes, they want America to get better. I don't hear any of them saying, well, America's flawed and therefore America shouldn't exist, or America's flawed and therefore I no longer want to support America. And then somehow American Jews, not many, but some, and some of them are very high profile, say because Israel's done this, that, or the other thing, or Israel hasn't done this, that, or the other thing, therefore I can no longer support the idea of a Jewish state. I mean, that's just ridiculous. When France does something you don't like, you say, I don't support the idea of France. Israel's not an idea that needs your support. Israel's a country. And it's going to exist whether you like it or hate it. Doesn't really matter. It's here. Russia is here. Ukraine is here. United States is here. France is here. Israel's here. Spain is here. Portugal's here. Brazil is here. Nobody's asking about any of those other countries. Should they exist or does it have a right to exist? Israel exists. And whether or not it has a right to exist, it's just kind of ludicrous. I mean, does Brazil have a right to exist? What kind of a stupid question is that? And I think the same question about whether Israel has a right to exist is just caving into the argument that's been peddled by Israel's enemies, the Palestinians especially, who've argued that Israel has no right to exist. And that we have to stop doing. So look, I mean, there's people like Daniel Levy, who is one of the founders of J Street, who said, if Israel's always going to be at war, then Israel wasn't a very good idea, was it? Well, America's been at war for all the years of its existence, except for 25 years, according to most people. America, a bad idea? I think America's an amazing idea. War is part of human life, tragically, horrifyingly, and I hope we can resolve the conflict that Israel's in. But this notion of conditional love has simply got to go. Number one. Number two, if you're a French citizen and you leave France and you move to America and you live, in Tucson and you speak French, I don't know how many French speakers there are in Tucson, but, let's say there's 10. Does France really care all that much, what you think France should do if you've made your life in Tucson? No, I mean, I think France wants you to feel warmly towards French culture in France, but it's not going to take your views into consideration. You left. By the same token, Israel is the country of its citizens when it comes to certain kinds of policies. And I think American Jews and Israelis need to figure out a way for American Jews to matter very, very much because they have a tremendous amount of wisdom. They've brought tremendous creativity religiously, culturally, morally, literarily, a gazillion different ways that Israel has benefited from over the course of many, many, many years and lots of decades. So we don't want them to be marginalized and only, write checks and show support. That's ridiculous. But by the same token, American Jews need to understand that you don't face the same challenges and dangers that Israelis face. And of course, the Palestinian conflict is grinding. And of course, the Palestinian conflict is debilitating. And of course, it's sad. And it's horrifying for them and for us, by the way. It's horrifying for both sides. But the fact that it's horrifying doesn't mean that we can fix it. And the analogy that I would use is race in America. Everybody knows that the race problem in America is horrifying. Everybody knows that the race problem in America is debilitating. Everybody knows that the race problem in America is depressing. Are we going to fix it? Is there going to be an era in which you and I are both alive and we're going to look at America and say America resolved its race issue? We're not. And I think that making America great is about working constantly to make America better. And that's what we need to have Israel do. But anybody who says if America can't fix its race problem by 2025, then I'm done, I think most Americans would say, so fine, you're done. Get out of the picture. Let us move on. And I think Israelis are beginning to think the same thing. So I think everybody's got to take a big step back from if you don't do this or that or the other thing, then I'm done with you. This conversation about whether Israel has a right to exist is a ludicrously stupid conversation. It's a country like any other country. It faces impossible challenges like many other countries. Let's find ways to have conversations in which we try to ennoble the other side. And I'll just end with this, that a classic trope of Talmudic conversation is if you and I are disagreeing, Todd, then in the Talmud, they would say, okay, Todd, what's the best side of Daniel Gordis's argument? And then they would say, okay, Gordis, now you disagree with Todd, that's true, but what's his strongest argument that you don't have a good response to? In other words, point out not the weakest part of his argument, point out the best part of his argument. And very often the Talmud will actually do that. And I think if we could actually say to Israeli Jews, why do American Jews think the way they think? Because they just want to be mad at us? What do they know that we don't know? What does our closeness not enable us to see about the situation that their distance allows them to see? And by the same token, have American Jews say to themselves, what is it about Israelis and the world in which they live? I mean, why, by the way, are even left-wing Israelis not talking about a two-state solution now? Are left-wing Israelis not really liberals? Are progressive Israelis not real progressives? Are, moral Israelis not really moral? Or is there something here about the Israeli reality that is just simply not translatable to America? Let's start giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And here, by the way, that's very Begin. I mean, Begin gave the benefit of the doubt to those Russian Jews who went to Vienna and then wanted to go to America. This is not for me to judge them. And he didn't judge American Jews, by the way, who chose not to make Aliyah. He said, people should live their Jewish lives where they think they can live the richest Jewish life and make the greatest possible contribution to the Jewish people. That was a very, very Begin notion. It was not an Ariel Sharon notion. It was not a David Ben-Gurion notion, but it was a Menachem Begin notion. Peoplehood means recognizing that we're going to disagree about really core issues, but that we're part of a shared enterprise nonetheless. Seems to me, and here I know Begin would say exactly the same thing, the greatest thing to happen to the Jewish people in thousands of years, without question, is the state of Israel. The future of the Jewish people is going to be written without question, largely on the stage called the State of Israel. So the question isn't, do I want to be part of it or do I not want to be part of it? Because if I'm not part of it or not part of that conversation, then I'm basically a footnote to Jewish history. But in what way do I want to have meaningful conversation and dialogue with it? That's, I think, what Begin would say. And in that particular regard, I happen to personally agree very much.
Well, I think that is a great place to start wrapping up. As I wrap up, I want to offer my deep gratitude to you, Daniel, for being with us, to all of us that were here, part of the conversation. I am going to share our mission statement as I bring us to a close, because we are inviting our community to do just that, to be on a self-propelled journey, to create and nurture a relationship that is both personal and meaningful to you, as we activate our community's journey together, where we can have these conversations. And as we begin the new Celebrate Israel's Birthday, and we begin from here, we're very excited about a year's worth of programming where we will have conversations like this, where we will begin to create literacy and language for our entire community, from the youngest of young to our oldest of old, to engage in these kind of conversations and be a part of this. I thank those of you that were here with us tonight, and we will be sharing this recording with others so that this is evergreen for us. Daniel, it was a deep, deep honor and pleasure for me, and thank you very much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Todd, if I can just say thank you very much for the honor of being with you. And I think it's a wonderful thing for Jews all across the world to be celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut and marking Yom HaAtzmaut together. It's not just an Israeli holiday. It's really an international Jewish celebration of the rebirth of Jewish life. So to have Americans and Israelis on the same call having this conversation is a great model. So kol hakavod to you for thinking of it. I'm honored that you reached out to me, and I look forward to us doing things together in the future as well.
Laila Tov to all.